It didn't work, but okay. Let's go. All right, so we are in Philippians chapter 4. So we'll probably finish Philippians 4 next week. That's my plan. I hope to get up to verse 13 today. We want to backtrack just a little bit. We're going to start back at verse 5 of Philippians 4 and just kind of get a running start at a couple of different things. So let's go ahead and read Philippians 4. We're going to read verses 5 through 7. Again, we've been over a little of this before, but just to remind us, between the church being off from many having COVID and then I didn't test positive until Saturday. That was just not quite right to come back yet. But things are fine now. I've got a little bit of sinus drainage. Kelly had some temperature issues and some sinus issues as well, but mostly has escaped her, so we're grateful for that. But verse 5 of Philippians 4, let your gentle spirit be known to all men. The Lord is near. Be anxious for nothing, but in everything by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving. Let your requests be made known to God. And the peace of God, which surpasses all comprehension, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus. So again, we were over verse 5 before, but again, I just want to briefly review this because it's a kind of a ramp up to these next verses of 8 and 9. The 8 and 9 are not just thrown in there just to be a nice little comfort, but rather we're looking at the peace of God, which comes from the God of peace that we get to in verse 9. We see a fruit of the Spirit coming through in Paul's teaching. Gentleness is a hallmark of the Christian faith, isn't it? Imagine if we dealt with each other according to the flesh all the time. There would be no getting along with each other to begin with. But gentleness is that hallmark that we look forward to. We know that someone really is a child of God and walking in the Spirit when they're confessing Jesus as Lord and are appropriately acting like it, when they're appropriately acting with gentleness. In fact, we can kind of know the opposite. If someone's not being gentle, who claims to be a Christian, who's not being gentle, we know that they're either not with the Lord or they're not walking in the Spirit, one of the two. So what do we mean by gentleness? Gentleness means not insisting on every right of the letter of the law or of custom. It means someone who yields to others, someone who's kind, who's courteous, and who's tolerant. Another word for this might be forbearing. When you're, to be honest with you, putting up with somebody with difficult things. The manner of interacting should be evident to all in the New Testament. Jesus is portrayed as the one who's gentle and lowly. Having all power and all wisdom, Jesus is actually known for his gentleness more than he's known for his justice, which is instructive for us just to where we are in the Christian life. There will become a day when he will be known for justice. The time we talk about after the tribulation and the beginning of the millennium, when Jesus comes to rule and reign, when we receive our glorified bodies, there will be an aspect where Jesus will be known for justice then. But now as we read, in Matthew chapter, is it 28? Matthew chapter 11, he's known as the gentle and the lowly one. He's the one who wants us to come to him, who wants us to be in his presence. And that's where we take our example from. Paul would refer to the gentleness of Christ in 1 Corinthians 10. And James likewise, who's always looking back to the teaching of Jesus in his letter. James calls on the believers to display gentleness as an application of wisdom from God, a lesson learned in the book of the wisdom literatures. When James chapter 3, verse 7 to 18 says, but the wisdom from above is first pure, then peace-loving, gentle, reasonable, full of mercy and good fruits, impartial, free of hypocrisy. And the fruit of righteousness is sown in peace by those who make peace. And so you find this recurring theme of one who's gentle is known as a person of peace. So when Paul's referring to verse 7, he says, and the peace of God is reflective of someone who is gentle. We get that association, we get that drift. But don't look past verse 5 too, when he says, let your gentle spirit be known to all, the Lord is near. The Lord is near is both a comfort and encouragement and a challenge to us as we think about our daily life. Sometimes, and I see this a lot in counseling that I have, people tend to forget that the Lord is near. There's been one guy I've been dealing with has a history of drugs and pornography. And as we've been working with each other since last March, and I'm starting to see a big change come around in his attention, in his walking through Proverbs chapters 5 and 6 and 7. Certainly not because of any magical thing that I've said, but as he's beginning to recognize, stepping out of himself, that the Lord is near. The Lord is always watching. Now there's a judgmental aspect where you want to understand that the Lord's always watching what's going on, and you'll get a just reward. But he's also starting to get the aspect, as he gets back into the Word, that the Lord is near as a comfort and a strength and encouragement. And the Psalms would talk about God being a strong tower, the place where we go to as a place of refuge. If you've been to Israel, I think the first 2 times we went to a village to the west of Jerusalem. And the name of it escapes me off the top of my head, but one of the things you visit while you're there is an example of a tower that would have been out in the fields, a place that you would run to if your field was being overrun or you were being invaded or there was some kind of danger. You would actually be able to go into the strong tower, and it's 2 or 3 stories tall, and you can heap all sorts of damage upon your enemy when you've got the high ground, unless you're talking about Star Wars, and that's a whole different thing. No, the Lord is a strong tower is meant to be this visual of God is the one who gives you the high ground, the protection, the coverage that you need. And so the Lord is near is a reminder that the Lord is always present with us. And in the midst of our difficulties and troubles, the Lord is near is supposed to bring us to the spot, as in verse 7, when we find the peace of God. All right, so in being reminded that the Lord is near, either in time or space, Paul moves on to talk about the Philippians, about anxiety. And while this last verse 7, might appear to be unconnected, as Paul is sometimes wont to do, sometimes as he gets a little close down the letter, or he starts to close down a letter, he starts to just scatter shoot, staccato, point. All these ideas are actually all connected. So even though he's giving them in a staccato fashion, just a little, here's a point, be gentle, the Lord is near, be anxious for nothing, and whatever's right, whatever true, whatever's low, it's just a boom, 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 boom. But at the same time, all these ideas are connected, right? The fact that the Lord, there's a gentle spirit, we should be aware that the Lord is near, and there's the peace of God. His theme throughout the whole letter has been about being unified in mind and spirit. And we can't do that if we don't sense that the Lord is near, if we're not being gentle with one another, if we're not sensing the peace of God, but rather if we're trying to go our own way for our own purposes and our own plan, there is no peace. So the reminder he gives us these little reminders and commands in staccato fashion, but here they're related in the fact of being gentle, because Jesus himself is gentle and lowly. He's the one whom we should emulate, and he's the one who we want to be like. So when he says, and the peace of God, which surpasses all comprehension, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus. This guarding is the aspect of, it will keep your minds from focusing upon the wrong things. Again, one of the things I see is that people, particularly anxious people, tend to we talked about this word before, perseverate. They tend to think on and meditate upon their problems rather than meditate on the Lord. To be anxious when he's here is to be apprehensive, to be unduly concerned. And in some sense, anxiety is a form of fear. Fear that the Lord's not going to be near, or fear that the Lord's not going to be taking care of you. And anxious people tend to meditate then upon this problem. Now, I'm not going to solve all of anxiety in one 5-minute clip out of the book of Philippians. There's certainly much more we could say. But the beginning of peace with God comes about when we're not meditating on our problems, when we're focusing on the Lord who's near. We're meditating upon him as our strong tower. We're meditating on him as our peace. So notice that the definition doesn't say concerned, but rather unduly concerned. For instance, if someone is coming at you with a hatchet, just to choose an example, would you be anxious?
Absolutely.
Would you be wrong to be anxious? No. That's how God has actually built you, right? The body remembers what it's supposed to do in times of fear, when you're being threatened. So being fearful is not a bad thing. But when I'm unduly concerned about that fear and I sit and meditate on that fear, that's what he's talking about. Right? So there's a good fear when we have a flight or fright kind of reaction. That's how God has actually built us. We're made in his image. He's actually built us that way.
I was always taught to run.
Always taught to, well, and it depends, right? One of the hostage situation that was down in Texas 2 weeks ago, they had been through a security training, right? And so he knew that in the case someone came in as an active shooter, one of the things he can do to distract it, to get other people out, was to throw a chair at the shooter. And he did, and got several people out, so that there were only 4 people left in, himself, the rabbi, and the 3 other people. He knew what to do. He was certainly anxious, but his training kicked in, and there's a certain peace that came in from knowing what the training was supposed to be. In a lot of respects, we're the same way. We need to train ourselves in being peaceful, appropriately responding, but not meditating upon it when the time comes. So in our meditation on scripture, we think on a passage, we pray through a passage, we try to apply personally that passage, but in our anxiety, we meditate on the problem, we ignore scripture, and we disobey any hard work at interpreting and applying a passage, but rather back to our model again of this dynamic heart that we've been walking through over the last several months. We think on the wrong things, love the wrong things, and because of the way the heart operates, we behave the wrong way in our circumstances, to others and to ourselves and to God. So what do I mean by anxiety and fear here? Just to give some examples. So there's a certain insecurity. Well, I know I've got to be concerned about my circumstances because God's given me a mind, but now I start to dwell on them and I'm uncertain about how things are all going to turn out. I'm not sure where my job's going to be, or I'm not sure where the money's going to come from, or I'm not sure. All these things that we're insecure about are a form of this anxiety. Or we're nervous about it, whether things are real or imagined. Now, I'm nervous about it, and it's affecting my entire body. When my body goes south, the soul goes with it. When my soul goes south, the body goes with it. We're tied together, body and soul. So if my body's being nervous, it's going to have its impact on my soul. And again, God drives us back to this example here of remembering that the Lord is near. There's a panic that can set in. The sense of fear can be so strong that the body response is equally as strong. And so we have panic attacks. You can actually go the other way. There's sort of a slippery slope. When we're not walking with the Lord, we have a slippery slope. We can go to the aspect of panic, or we can go to the aspect of just completely shutting down and being passive. A tendency toward being paralyzed in life that occurs because, again, of a real or a threat or perceived threat. Fear of failure makes me not want to try, or a fear of rejection makes me avoid circumstances. So we can go on the one side and be completely nervous about it, the other way completely shut down and be paralyzed by it. So all these things are kind of examples of fear, but God doesn't call us to that. He calls us to himself. He calls us to remember being gentle, being slow to ponder, that the Lord himself is near, and to be anxious, not meditating on our problems, but meditating on the Lord. So the opposite of fear is hope. Would you agree with that statement? The opposite of fear is hope. We hope that the Lord is near because he's told us so, but we hope, even by faith, we have to trust that it is so. We don't see the Lord as near, but we trust that he is so.
So is trust the same as hope? Because I was going to say trust.
I think they're a measure, they're related to each other, is a trust and a hope. Because a trust isn't a wishful thinking of, I sure hope this turns out,
Right.
But it's a trust that the Lord is the one who's promised it will fulfill it. I think they're very much related. That makes sense?
Yeah, I think fear is a lack of trust.
True.
So,
Yeah.
Good answer.
Yes,
Sorry.
it's not that.
So the biblical solution for anxiety is the confident expectation of the Lord's supply. Again, it's very simple to say. It's a little bit different to reorient your thinking. But it is the Lord's supply and in his time. We have to believe that, first of all, God's plan is perfect. There's one thing I see, again, people who get anxious, people who get disturbed, are forgetting that the Lord's plan is perfect. I'm going to have you turn to 4 different verses with me on this particular idea. First one is Psalm 18, verse 30. It can't be, because Psalm 18, oh, there we go. Okay, verse 30, Psalm 18. Psalm 18, verse 30, as for God, his way is blameless. The word of the Lord is tried. He is a shield to all who take refuge in him. So the first thing we see is God's plan is perfect. He's above reproach when he has made a plan. And we'll look a little bit later to God's plan as well when we get to Deuteronomy 29. But one of the things we have to trust on is the aspect of God is in control of the detail. So we're reminded again that the Lord is near. The Lord is near, the one who has a perfect plan. And that's what the entire book of Romans chapter 8 is all about. God's plan is perfect. Is his plan always pleasant? That would not be the word I would use. Now, our lines can fall to pleasant places, but there are times when we know we're being disciplined. We're being trained for a different purpose. We're being trained to be more God-like. And sometimes that exercise is difficult for us. We read that in Hebrews chapter 10 and chapter 12. So the plan that God uses, the discipline he uses to show us his plan is not always pleasant, but it is always perfect. So over to Matthew chapter 10 and verse 30. Matthew chapter 10 and verse 30. A very simple verse. But the very hairs on your head are all numbered. God's plan is exhaustive. Some of us more than others. God's plan is exhaustive. His meticulous planning, his careful execution of his plan is so exhaustive that he has every hair on your head numbered.
That is amazing.
It's startling.
Yes, it is.
Now, I'm glad that God gets a little bit less of my hair to be concerned about every day. But at the same time, it's amazing to me that he has the birds feeding under control. He has my hair under control. Well, he has the numbers of my hair under control. But God has that level of control over our details. And we forget that, don't we? We kind of forget that God is in, and when things come upon us, and we're tended to be, we tend to want to be anxious in a situation where we're concerned about what the future is going to be. We need to be reminded that God's plan is both perfect and exhaustive. And then Romans 8:28, which again you know, but let's refer to there. Now, here's the problem with going to Romans 8:28. That's like skipping right straight to the punchline of a joke and not telling the joke. Right, so there are verses that come after it and the verses that come before it, and someday we'll go through those. But we know verse 28 is a great comfort to us, and we know that God causes all things to work together for good to those who love God, to those who are called according to his purpose. And then he goes through the why that's so. And the first part of the chapter 8 is all the difficulties that lead up to that punchline, so to speak. But God's plan is for my ultimate good. We have to trust that these things are so because God has said it's so. And again, it's a marvelous thing that God has spoken to us through his word. From Genesis through Revelation, we find out that God has spoken to us and he wants us to know about his plan. He wants us to know about himself, that he's kind and compassionate and gentle and good and providential. And then finally, Deuteronomy 29:29. Deuteronomy 29, I can quote it, but I'll do it injustice somehow. It's just how it goes. Yeah, Deuteronomy 29:29. My fingers are not working today.
Getting there. Wait, hold on.
Okay. You there? Got it, Gina?
Yes.
All right. The secret things belong to the Lord our God, but the things revealed belong to us and to our sons forever, that we may observe all the words of this law. God has spoken to us in words, and he wants us to know his will, and the things that he's revealed to us, he's holding us accountable to them, and he gives us the strength to fulfill them through his Spirit. That's what the new covenant's all about. But there's one thing about here is that the secret things belong to the Lord. There are secret things, and how often do we concentrate praying upon God, reveal to your will to me? Whom should I marry? Is there a single passage in the entire Bible that says, pray to God for knowledge as to who you're to marry? No. Which job to take? Which house to buy? Which car to buy? A new car, a used car? These things are wisdom that we look for the Lord to guide and to open doors, but they're secret. They're part of the secret plan. And there's a reason it's secret. It's secret. You're not going to know the secret things. But God's plan is secret. But God is in control of that plan. Right? The one who believes these things, that God's plan is perfect, that his plan is exhaustive, that his plans for our ultimate good and his plan is secret, the one who believes these things has hope in the God who provides. And again, one of the things I see people who get anxious forget the God of these things. We all see this passage. What we all see in this passage is that when we're focused on the providence of God, that notion that God created an exhaustive plan and meticulously executes it by his sovereignty and by his power, the result in the inner man is peace, when we're trusting in that. And you've seen it in people you've known, people who could be overwhelmed potentially with all the things that happen to them, and yet there's a certain peace that passes all understanding that's with that person, isn't it? And comes from the Lord. This is what Paul means when he says, keeps your heart, it guards your hearts and your minds. It protects them from going off the deep end, so to speak. It protects us from being overwhelmed by things that would make us anxious. It's not wrong for us to be anxious, and it's wrong for us to stay being anxious. Anxious, again, is how the body responds to its perceived idea that there's a risk to me out there somewhere. But for us to stay there is what he's saying we should not do. So again, this is what Paul means when he says hearts and minds. This is a directive to the church in its primary sense. I want to go back to Philippians 4, and I want to kind of rehearse this again. One of the things that struck me for some reason this last year, as you look through all the letters to the churches, is that they are letters to the churches. And when he's kept commanding them, oftentimes the you is plural. Meaning it's not just you as individuals within the church, he's talking actually directly to the church. So the primary application is, let your gentle spirit be known to all men. The church, this should be the church's job to be known as gentle. The Lord is near. The Lord is near to the church. Be anxious for nothing. The church should not be anxious for what's going to happen. Should we be concerned? Should we make plans? Absolutely. But we trust in the God whose plan is perfect and exhaustive and secret and for our ultimate good. And all of that will surpass all comprehension and will guard our hearts and our minds in Christ Jesus. The church that does these things focuses upon Christ. So now, when I say it applies to the churches, it doesn't mean it can't secondarily belong to us as individuals, because we are the stones which make up the household of the church. But the primary application is to the church. So secondarily, it applies to us individually, enabling us to be at peace with one another. Now, don't misunderstand me. I'm not saying that moving from a life of worry, fear, and anxiety to one of peace is necessarily easy. Right? When you get into a habit of thinking, it's hard to redirect that thinking. But that's what being in the Word does, is it changes our thinking. It changes what we love. It changes how we behave. It takes time to be renewed, but it's possible because God's Word declares that it's possible and desirable and knowable. What God requires, he also enables.
Amen.
So in 2 Peter 1, verse 3, for his divine power has granted to us everything pertaining to life and godliness through the true knowledge of him who called us by his own glory and excellence. God is the one who calls us to being not anxious. God is the one who calls us to be peaceful. and God is the one who enables it. What God promises is the blessing of a mind focused on God's essence and his ability, and that guards our hearts and minds in our difficult circumstances. All right, so let me stop there. Any questions about that? Yeah, it's kind of a review of where we've been, but I didn't say everything I wanted to say last time we met, which was 3 weeks ago. It seems like a long time. It's funny how illness will get you like that. All right, so let's go back to Philippians. We'll go to verses 8 and 9. Finally, brothers and sisters, whatever is true, whatever is honorable, whatever is right, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is of good repute, if there's any excellence, and if anything worthy of praise, dwell on these things. The things you've learned and received and heard and seen in me, practice these things, and the God of peace will be with you. Again, don't miss the point that in verse 7, the peace of God is what's desired, and it comes from, in verse 9, the God of peace. So, these last two verses really are not throwaway verses, some platitudes meant to make us feel good. Rather, they're the means by which we learn to meditate on God's plan and how to care for God's people. I hope you're looking forward to the Caring for One Another book. It's a book that it's very practical. It's 8 weeks. It's not that long. I didn't think Philippians would be 4.5 months either, but here we are. But no, it's a guy I highly respect. A guy named Ed Welch, and so we'll walk through that together. But in essence, we're basing on Philippians. We're going to be able to launch into the caring for one another, I think, in a good place. But these verses are not throwaway. We're meant to learn how to meditate upon God's provision and God's plan and God's holiness and his ability, his providence, who he is, and that's what brings us peace. We meditated on God's plan and how to care for God's people in a way that honors him because of our fear of the Lord, and I mean that in a reverential fear and awe and a love for him. And as I go through these, a couple of these different meanings of what these terms are, think about your own lives and habits. Think about how you spend your time in entertainment, TVs and plays and movies. These aren't bad things. We all need to relax and kind of have some downtime. So these are good things. And in your pastimes, in your discussions with one another about others. Whatever's true. F.F. Bruce, who I've quoted often in here, in the study of Philippians, he says, this is a warning against mental fantasies and baseless slanders. He's talking about facts, focusing on the facts, not the appearance of facts, rather than not something imagined. Right? So he's not talking about using our imagination to say, well, I saw Joe so-and-so walk into a pub. Now, in the UK, that's where you get food. It's called a restaurant. So, different cultures in different places. And when I went over with school back in 2018, we were in Oxford for a couple of weeks. The professor actually had to sit everybody down, and because they were all from pretty strict Baptist backgrounds, most of them were. And he told me, he says, to go into a pub is not a bad thing. Now, in the United States, it might be looked at, frowned upon the people you're with and your churches and so on. But here, this is like a restaurant. This is where you buy food. So we had to kind of talk them off the ledge. But if we just say someone went into a pub, that's an appearance of evil in some people's mind. And we've got to get past the appearance of evil to what are the real facts. Right? So we can't look on just the outward side, just the outward appearance. We've actually got to get to know people and to know the things that they're going through. That might not be the best example, but it's not what I could come up with. Yeah.
Well, I wanted to bake a cake. It was a brown sugar pound cake with a caramel rum sauce. And I really had stress about going to the liquor store to buy one of them small bottles. So I sent my son.
Sorry, I had a pastor whose wife was making a chili recipe that required a can of beer. And she had to go down the block to some neighbor with $2 and ask if she could buy it.
What, buy a bottle of beer? Yeah. Lisa, you're gonna?
I was just gonna say, I think that whenever that we should never be quick to judge, because a lot of times even a friend or through a text message or something, somebody may say something, and you have to look at the heart of that person. That, when you look at the heart of that person, I know that person would never mean to offend me. Or that she really didn't mean it, or she must have been having a bad day, because I know that is not the true heart of that person. And that person walking into the pub, you're like, well, I know them not to be an alcoholic. I mean,
Yeah.
to know the true heart of a person, and I think that's something that we're sometimes we're very quick to judge rather than to look at who the person is.
Well, and there is a certain legalism which says that's part of what is in the Gospels as well. And the Pharisees were constantly judging based on the appearance of things. And so Jesus is quick to point those out. And what Jesus is quick to point out is that's not true. That's not a true understanding of what God has prescribed in the Old Testament. I know I was there. and what came about from your oral tradition. So thank you for those comments. So whatever's true, not looking at the outward side and the appearance, but looking at what's in the heart, as much as we can do that. Whatever is honorable. Whatever is honorable is kind of the opposite of what's vulgar or common, something virtuous or something dignified. We can sometimes say crude jokes and those might be even okay, but as we talk with one another, as we focus our minds on things, we've got to be focusing upon what's an honorable thing versus what's just an acceptable thing. Most people think that the opposite of holy is what's the word? Vulgar. But the opposite of holy is common.
Thank you, Mark.
The opposite of holy is just the things that are common. And so we have to be able to focus upon the holy things, but even the common things can be honorable, right? Yeah. When you make supper every night, is that an honorable thing?
Yes.
Unless it's a burnt offering.
Plus there's too much garlic.
There's too much garlic.
There's too much garlic and then it's honorable.
That would be from your Italian relatives?
He has a tendency to hang around for
Yeah. No, so
I had to cut back.
My timer is a smoke alarm.
no, those would be the unhonorable things. But no, whatever is honorable again is just the things that are virtuous, the things that are dignified. Those are the things we should focus on. Whatever is right or righteous, whatever builds someone up rather than treats them as an enemy. And this is the things that, again, I'll refer to counseling every once in a while, and hopefully I'm not giving away details that let you, but sometimes you have couples come in the counseling room they love each other, but they do not treat each other like they love each other. They are treating each other like enemies. Like, you're in the way of my happiness. I will argue with you till the cows come, because I have to win this argument to show you how much I love you. There's a certain weird logic that comes into play. But here it's whatever's right or righteous. Whatever builds someone up, not treats them like an enemy. Whatever is pure, that is pure in thought and pure in intent, holy. Whatever is lovely, something intrinsically attractive, agreeable, beautiful. The idea is something that inspires love. You want to avoid giving any offense, but rather draw the person's mind into glorifying God because of the beauty of the thing. Whatever is commendable, something that enjoys a good reputation, that's appealing or worthy. If there's any excellence or anything worthy of praise, these are parallel ideas that add to each other. Again, this is almost like a wisdom literature from the Proverbs, where you have when he says, if there's anything excellent and anything worthy of praise. So it gives you an idea of what something of excellence is something that's worthy of praise. The idea of excellence is something virtuous and something praiseworthy, wonderful, something worth repeating. If these are yours, it's awfully hard not to be on the same page, which points back to the idea of being unified throughout the whole book of Philippians. If the opposite of these things are characterized you, it's impossible to be on the same page. Whether that's as a church, or whether that's in the marriage, or whether that's just with your friends. Right? When you start to treat each other as enemies, or you start guessing intent, and you start, rather than asking questions and entering into a dialogue, right? If your mind starts to invent things to think about that treats the other person like an enemy, you're not going to be on the same page, and you'll find yourself not having many friends. Right? But it's awfully hard not to be on the same page. With these two verses, then, we conclude with just one question, which pulls the whole passage together. So as we look through verses 4 and 5, we find our relationships, right? We find that we need to be rejoicing. We'll go back to verse 4 again. Rejoice in the Lord always. Again, I will say, rejoice. There's a certain law about our relationships that we need to be rejoicing with each other and for each other, and we need to be forbearing, putting up with each other, overlooking an offense. And those things get you in the mind to not treat the person as an enemy, but to treat them as a loved one. Verse 6, we find the idea of prayer in our circumstances. Be anxious for nothing, but in everything by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving. That is, I'm not praying about dwelling on my circumstances. I'm praying about seeing God come work through my circumstances and seeing God change me as a result of my circumstances. And so we have a law of circumstances. Verse 8, we think about these things. That is, what should our thoughts be on? Whatever is right, whatever is true, whatever is honorable, whatever is right. And I can't tell you how many number of times of the couples I meet with, how many times I have to stop them and go back to both Galatians 6:1 to treat each one another with gentleness, and then Philippians 4:8 to think about the things that are true and right and lovely. They just don't. So there's the law of our thoughts. And then verse 9, the things you have learned and received and heard and seen in me, practice these things, and the God of peace will be with you. Now it's the law of our behavior. Verse 9 tells us what to do. Practice these things. Changing our mind, changing our behavior, thinking about being unified together doesn't come about just because we walk in the front door and just because I sign a membership card. It comes about through practice of what our mind thinks on and what we love that results in a change in our behavior. And as a result of that, then the peace of God will come from the God of peace. All right, so any questions at that point? Criticisms, complaints? Martha?
When I look at this list, it seems like it makes a very nice addendum to 1 Corinthians 13.
Yeah.
Because, it's like it tells you what love is, and then this tells you how to love.
Yeah. And notice that it starts with the mind. It starts with the mind and what the mind focuses on, what the mind prays about. Again, the New Testament is really about two different things: how our bodies act and how our minds act, or how our hearts act, I should say, it's a better term. But we're talking about the outer man and the inner man. And don't mistake the two. We're really just talking about those two things, and they affect one another, as we've talked about before. And I can't very well love someone I can't very well love someone with my actions if my mind's focused upon thinking untrue things or unhonorable things or unholy things. Yeah, so thank you. Any other questions or comments? One more.
Years ago, I lived in an apartment building, and the people downstairs were having a fight. And I guess he went and she locked the door, and he's pounding on the door. And he's like, "Let me in! I ain't gonna hurt you." And I'm thinking, what fool would let him in? Girl, don't you know I love you? I would never do you no harm. He's like kicking the door.
Yeah.
I called the police because it's like that love was gonna kill him.
Yeah, that's not the kind of love
So he was saying he wasn't gonna hurt her, but his actions were.
Yeah.
Showing something.
Because at that point, your mind is out of control at that point.
Absolutely.
All right, verses 10 to 13 in our time remaining. But I rejoiced in the Lord greatly that now at last you have revived your concern for me. Indeed, you were concerned before, but you lacked opportunity. Not that I speak from want, for I have learned to be content in whatever circumstances I am. I know how to get along with humble means, and I also know how to live in prosperity. In any and every circumstance, I have learned the secret of being filled and going hungry, both of having abundance and suffering need. I can do all things through him who strengthens me. Believe it or not, even though most Bibles stop at verse 14, I think the context actually stops at 13. 14 picks up with more of the application from there. Now, here's where I have to share my screen a little bit.
Yeah.
And Right. Let's get that. All right, so when it says, I can do all things, the verse taken out of context. That's where verse 13 will come into play. So just keep that in mind for today. Now I have to remember how to unshare. Oh, that's not good. There we go.
Where did you find that?
Where, who knows where I find stuff?
I would like.
I know.
Okay. Of course I can. Well, that's where it's going to stay today. We'll fix it later. All right, so again, but now I rejoiced. So again, the idea of rejoice here is the same as it was before. But what's interesting is that when he says rejoice in the Lord always, again I say rejoice. In some sense, what Paul does in verses 5 through 9 is rehearse what it means to be content. I want you to see what I'm saying, because I think he repeats the example here when he gets to verse 10. But I rejoiced in the Lord greatly that now at last you revived your concern, because I want to tell you, I've learned contentment. So in learning contentment, Paul's focusing his mind upon the things that are true and that are right and that are lovely. That he's not being anxious for anything, rather he's focusing upon seeing the Lord's plan and his provision and his exhaustive providence. In all respects, Paul's teaching you in verses 5 through 9 how to be content. And in verse 10, he's telling you how he is content as well. Right? So when he says, first of all, not first of all, but when he says, you have revived your concern for me, this is the final use of our word here twice in this passage, where he's talking about being of the same mind. The Philippians were in the same page and had the same mind about their approach to ministry, their approach to people, as did Paul. They were exactly on the same page. And although he's had to correct them, saying, hey, these people that are preaching the gospel, even after you don't understand their motive, they're still preaching the gospel. Don't treat them as enemies. And he would come along a little bit later and said, now these people over here, they are your enemies. Be thinking the same thing about them. So his idea here is that when he says, you revived your concern for me, indeed you were concerned before, but you lacked opportunity. We've talked before about how the church had gathered an offering and taken it and sent it with Epaphras off to where Paul was being held in prison. And Paul has said, I really didn't need it. I did not need the money per se, but I take it as a gracious act on your part that you've given to me, and we'll put it to good use. But I want to let you know I've learned to be content whether I have a lot or a little. And Paul didn't have a specific need at the time because he had learned contentment in spite of his circumstances. The idea of learned means to come to a realization with an implication of taking place less through instruction than through experience or practice. That is to learn or to appropriate to oneself. Paul had learned through practice to keep his mind straight on what is it that God has planned for me. Does he have planned for me to live with less food, less clothing? So to live with less food, less clothing? Now,
So you know where you are.
Yes,
Tell your
I told you,
concern.
I've been so messed up.
it has the idea here of viewing myself as having sufficiency for all my needs. That is, I have an adequate supply for the things that I actually need. Now, I may want more, but there's a difference between a want and a need. And Paul's saying is, I have what I need. This is the only time this word, when he talks about the idea of learned here, it has the only time it's used in here. And one individual, and I think it's by Professor Jones from school, said contentment is not found, it is learned. Would you agree with that statement?
Yes, so.
Contentment is not found, it's learned.
It is a practice.
It's a practice. And that's, again, what verses 5 through 9 are how do we practice that? How do we get there? And what he's having in verse 10 to 13, he's saying, here's how I got there. Not to exalt himself, but rather to calm them and let them know they shouldn't be anxious for his circumstances. He's learned how to be content as well. In a lot of respects, what you find out is that contentment is what leads to joy. Joy is not just go from here I am to I'm joyful, but rather in my circumstances, I'm learning to be content with here's what I have. I don't have any more, I don't have any less. This is what God's given me. And from that circumstance, then I can learn joy. Joy isn't, we just don't go from where we are to joy, but rather we learn contentment, and that leads to joy. At least that's how I see the equation happening in my mind. You may disagree, and that's okay, but it just seems like that seems to be what Paul is talking about, the equation here. So contentment is not found, it must be learned. I have learned to be content whatever the circumstances. I have learned the secret of being content in every situation. Contentment is not a mystery to discover, but a dynamic to learn. It doesn't kick in automatically at conversion. It derives from a process of Christian growth. We learn how to be content. How do we learn how to be content? Hebrews would tell us we learn contentment by being disciplined. We learn contentment by being deprived. We learn contentment by having an abundance and learning how to manage that and being a good steward of that, right? So here's where we have to be content, be careful though. There was an idea in Greek philosophy, in the philosophy called Stoicism, where the ability to be self-content became the essence of all virtues. For the Stoics, you knew you had arrived at being a good Stoic philosopher if you were content in everything. Contentment's not a bad goal to have, but what they were saying is, I've learned how to be content in myself. Rather than looking at God and his plan, they were looking at me and myself and my plan. To be independent of one's things, money, property, and even friends, one had to be self-sufficient and self-reliant. And that's not what Paul's referring to. He's not saying, I have the ability to pull myself up my bootstraps and be content in how I accomplish things. That's what Stoicism would be. Contentment in the Lord is I have the ability to rely upon the Lord, trusting in his sovereign plan. That no matter what happens, it's for my good and for God's glory. And yes, they may be difficult, but I can be content in the plan that God has, and that will bring me joy. Now, I'm going to stop there. Am I making sense? Or am I just saying words that, I know they're all English words, but do they fit together in your head?
Yes.
Okay.
We're content.
All right. The idea of being self-reliant and self-sufficient is not part of God's plan. This is why our next lesson is on caring for one another. We have to learn how to trust others to help care for us, even when we cannot or don't. Right? This is not God's plan. God has designed us to respond to himself and to our circumstances, to himself, other circumstances, others, and ourselves. Just real quickly, I know we're out of time, but we respond in this idea of contentment to God himself. Proverbs chapter 30, verse 8 says, "Keep deception and lies far from me. Give me neither poverty nor riches. Feed me with the food that is my portion." That's in Proverbs 38. By the way, that idea of portion directly relates to the words that are here. In the Septuagint, those would be the same words that the translators would use. This idea is also in Timothy. But godliness actually is a means of great gain when it is accompanied by what? Contentment. In 1 Timothy 6:6. And in Hebrews 12:11, "For the moment, all discipline seems not to be pleasant, but painful. Yet to those who've been trained by it, who have learned contentment, afterward it yields the peaceable fruit of righteousness." So we learn to have contentment as it respects God, who's providentially in control of the entire plan and meticulously and exhaustively working to fulfill that. We learn contentment because of our circumstances, and God uses our circumstances in the process of sanctification. Think about Job's life. Which one of you, if you weren't content, if you had had your entire personal belongings destroyed on the same day that your 10 children were killed? That doesn't mean he was instantly over it, But in the process, he learned contentment. And that's what we know for our good. Elijah in the broom tree. Elijah began to rely upon the broom tree. And what happened when the broom tree got destroyed? He was no longer content because his circumstances had changed and he didn't realize that God was disciplining him through that. That's in 1 Kings 19. So whether it's our jobs, our marriages, our churches, our friends, we learn to be content because of the circumstances. We learn to care for one another. We learn contentment with others. And this has been one of the subpoints of Philippians. Paul felt the kinship of the Philippian Christians. He knew of their love. They had gathered this offering out of their poverty and given to them, or given to Paul, so he would not be without need. So he would be without need or want. And far from making himself independent from them, he grew in his love for them because on occasion they provided for his needs. God has designed the church exactly that same way. Not that we become dependent upon one another, but God who supplies our needs through others gets the glory when we reflect his need as well. How many have received a gift or a package or a word of kindness at just the right moment when you need to be encouraged? That was God working through others. And then finally, ourselves. Our self-help culture is preoccupied with self-talk. A guy named Dave Powlison said. Does what you say to yourself cheer you up or tear you down? Do you say, I'm a valid person and I can stand up for myself? Or I'm so stupid I always fail? Have you said those things to yourself? Either one or both? And that's the self-help creature or culture creeping in. Entire systems of counseling revolved around reconstructing this self-talk so that I can be happier and more productive. And it's a lie straight from the pit. Right? The problem with self-talk is that we're not talking to anyone but ourselves. We're not talking to God. We're not getting God's words in our heart. We're not relying upon it. We're not reflecting upon his plan or his provision. We're looking within ourselves and internally. When we have problems, we don't go off and get alone by ourselves in order to understand ourselves. We get off and get alone to understand God and his purposes. So normally when we talk to ourselves, in some sense, helping ourselves means we start relying upon ourselves, not upon God's words. So we're content in little and content in prosperity. And that's what Paul is meaning in this passage. Paul's not talking when he gets to verse 13, when he says, I can do all things through him who strengthens me, as if he parachuted that verse into the middle of this passage without context. He's saying, in the midst of my financial difficulties, in the midst of my learning contentment, I have learned contentment. He's not saying I can do all things. I can run faster, jump higher, whatever the other part of the commercial was back in the 50s and 60s, 60s and 70s. Huh?
That was it.
Run faster, jump higher.
PF Flyers.
Yeah, PF Flyers, that's right. Paul's not talking about that. He's talking about, I can learn contentment. That's what he's talking about. Not this idea of somehow there's this mystical strength that overcomes it when I'm self-reliant and self-sufficient and think really well of myself. Or I'm full of self-esteem. Another day, but another life straight from the pit. Right? The secret of being filled and hungry, the secret is of abundance and suffering need. In my financial circumstances, I have learned contentment. Now, the application has a broader meaning of that in our circumstances, in our difficulties, we can learn contentment. It is talking about financial primarily, but again, what he's saying is in a broader context, I can learn contentment, which leads to joy. I can learn contentment in no matter what circumstance I'm in. And that's the thing for us to emulate as we begin to pray. We can learn joy when we learn contentment. We can learn contentment when I think the right things, when I think the true things, when I think the lovely things, when I think that the Lord is near, when I learn how to be gentle. All those things lead to contentment. And then we find the God of peace. We find the peace of God from the God of peace. Let's pray. Father, we thank you for, again, your word and all the example it is to us of how to be content with you, to be reliant upon you as the God of the universe, the creator of all, who has loved us enough to send us our son, your son. but who also sent your Spirit to dwell within us, to give us the strength, and through the power of your Spirit and the power of your word, to conform us into your image, that we might be content and we might be full of joy, all for your glory, as we give thanks in Jesus' name. Amen.
Big boys need to stretch a little well instead of the short cuts for me. You need to get rid of too. Next time you skip home.
He's fine, he taught Sunday school. Oh. So, and I got lost and I go to Sunday school, and so we'll both go to the second service, you know, and